A very warm welcome to everyone that is joining us. We're just going to take a few moments before we get started, just so others can join this roundtable discussion. The previous session is just overrunning, so we will have more people joining us as that ends. But welcome to everyone. Do feel free to say hi in the chat. We've also got lots of events going on for the rest of the day, different workshops and roundtables as well. So we hope that we will see you at some of those too. A big thank you to those of you getting up extra early to join us as well, or who are staying up particularly late. We're really grateful to have such a global audience here. So this session is a roundtable discussion on rethinking economics and collapsed futures. And we're really grateful to be joined by Steve Keen and Julia Steinberger, and Anne Pettifor may hopefully join us a bit later on. Steve is joining us today as a post-Keynesian economist and the author of Debunking Economics. He's an expert on financial instability and ecological limits. And Julia Steinberger is an ecological economist, an IPCC author, a professor focused on sufficiency, well-being, and post-growth pathways. Welcome to you both today. Thank you for joining us. So this session today, we're just going to invite Steve and then Julia just to speak for a little bit, and then I'll be facilitating a discussion with them both. And then we should have some time at the end for a Q&A. So you are able to put your questions in the Q&A function box. So I'll hand it over to Steve, who will get us started. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm just going to show a brief set of slides here because you really have to see what economists write to realise how crazy they are. So can you see my screen at the moment? Good. Okay. This is not an economist, but it's somebody who takes economics seriously, which is a mistake. And that's a guy called Stuart Kirk, who was for a while the head of responsible investing at HSBC. And this speech got him kicked out of there, but he's now writing for the Financial Times. And his argument is quite common. You'll find it in almost everybody working in finance, that there's climate change ain't going to matter. It's going to be a negligible little thing. The best estimates done by the IPCC, and that clearly doesn't include Julia here, it's the economics chapters of the IPCC, say that 3.6 degrees of warming by 2100 will reduce GDP by, say, 5%. And he says, what they fail to tell you, there's going to be so much growth between now and then, you won't even notice that fall. And that's what is actually baked into what economists tell policy advisors and politicians and journalists on the impact of global warming, even though they're putting out what look like large numbers there. So what actually was said by the IPCC wasn't quite as low as he claimed. The 2022 version said there'd be a 10 to 23% fall in GDP in 2100 from 4 degrees of warming. This is the sort of stuff which the parts of the IPCC that politicians get their advisors to read are the parts written by the economists. Now, that translates to less than a 0.1% fall in the rate of economic growth. It's trivial, okay? And the IPCC said as much, and I can tell you who the author is, anybody wants to ask later, executive summary for the economics chapter in 2014. For most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small compared to other drivers. And they've got high agreement. Most of the economists who write this stuff agree with each other about this. Changes in population, age, income, technology, relative prices, lifestyle, regulation, anything, TikTok is going to matter more than climate change, is what they're pretty much saying here. And that's the common belief across economists. And it's really because they have no bloody idea what they're talking about. They have made up their own numbers on climate change that bear no relation to the work being done by climate scientists. And we've trusted them. The belief most people had, and I was told this by my fellow heterodox economists when I decided to actually read the literature, don't worry, it'll just be they use too high a discount rate. Well, that's got nothing to do with it. It's fantasy numbers they make up. So here's a comparison side by side of economists versus scientists. And this is Nordhaus in a paper written in 2018, shortly after he was given the Nobel Prize for Economics for it. 6 degrees of warming will reduce GDP by 8.5% in the far future. Scientists, on the other hand, have redefined they've broken down the gradation of dangerous warming into 3, and say more than 5 degrees is unknown, implying beyond catastrophic, including existential threats. That's what the climate scientists are saying, and they're stunned. Nobody's listening to them. It's because people are listening to the economists. And it's incredible how bad their work is. This is a statement by Nordhaus saying there'd be a survey by Lenton back in 2008 that concluded there's no critical tipping elements in the climate for anything less than 300 years in the future with anything less than 3 degrees of warming. Now, what was actually said by that paper, and this is in the conclusion, a variety of tipping elements could reach their critical point this century, not in 300 years' time. The greatest threats being Arctic and Greenland, but a number of others could surprise us. The thing on the left is supposed to be a summary of the thing on the right. Complete contradiction instead. They see what they want to see. And that has led to about 2,500 economists who specialise in this basically getting themselves publication brownie points for it. They were surveyed in 2021 about what would happen if we have a trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming in 2 centuries' time. And this is the answer that they gave. It was about 300 of them replied to the survey, more than 10% of the population, so it's quite realistic. 5% fall with 3 degrees of warming in 2075, 10% with 5 degrees, and 7 degrees of 20% fall. Now, those numbers themselves look big, but what they're doing is comparing 2 future hypothetical numbers, GDP with global warming of that level of rise and GDP with no global warming at all. They're 2 fictional numbers. If you take it back and say, what are you predicting in terms of the decline in the rate of economic growth from a trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming, it actually works out to a 0.02% fall in the annual rate of economic growth, which, as Stuart Kirk said, you won't even notice it. That's because that's 1/5 of the accuracy with which we actually measure GDP change today. Whereas scientists are saying 5 degrees or more, we're probably going to go extinct. That's the gap between what economists are saying and what scientists are saying. And the reason for these gaps comes out of their sheer stupidity of mainstream economics. So here's Nordhaus from 1991 saying for the bulk of the economy, and look what he's got, manufacturing, mining. I'm happy to discuss that in a moment afterwards. Utilities, finance, wholesale and retail tried most service industries. It is difficult to find major direct impacts of the projected climate changes for the next 50 to 75 years. They simply dismissed any possibility of it. Now, in the real world, this is some work that I ended up doing in 2019, they ignore the role of energy in production. And whenever if you don't have energy, you have a corpse where you have human beings, you have sculptures where you have machinery. So when you put that together, what you find is that energy, with most of us are coming from fossil fuels now, of course, is by far the major determinant of GDP. If we face a crunch, which we do on energy because so much of it is fossil fuel based, we're going to find a collapse in GDP. So here's the correlation of GDP measured in American 2017 dollars, I think, versus energy consumption measured in millions of tons of oil equivalent. And whenever I produce something like this, my first reaction is that if I wanted to make up numbers to support my case, I wouldn't dare make numbers that are as strong as what you find in the actual data. These are 2 totally different measures, basically a straight line. When you look at the change in GDP versus the change in energy, again, it's absolutely lock solid. What they're ignoring is that we get our energy from fossil fuels. The energy from fossil fuels generates carbon dioxide. That's what's warming the planet, which is going to destroy the Holocene, what's already destroyed the Holocene climate. That's what economists can't actually get their heads around. That's why they're so dangerous. And frankly, if we wanted to make economists make a positive contribution, they should swap places with Roger Hallam.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's a lot of food for thought for us to dive into in discussion in a moment. And I'll hand over to Julia.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation, all the organization. Thanks to everybody who's here. So I didn't have slides to start with, but because I'm an academic, I might show some anyway. But I just wanted to basically add on some points. So first of all, Steve is absolutely right in terms of the criminal damage that neoclassical economics and its wild limitations, blinkers, and deliberate misunderstanding of reality has already done to our biosphere, and the fact that it's so influential in policy and basically shuts out anybody who's doing real empirical science, whether it's on the climate side, the economic side, or the social science side. We all get drowned out because these people have basically made a career for themselves saying, making up reasons why this is not a problem. I guess what I would like to add to that is a couple of things. One is on, okay, what do we do now? Which is on I'm an advocate of degrowth and post-growth, partly because I spent a good many years, basically when I was a postdoc, looking for green growth, this growth where economic growth works and we have reducing environmental impacts of various kinds. And I looked for it and looked for it in the data, and by, sort of 15 years ago, I had easily convinced myself that it did not exist. And it was time to look for something else, because obviously our economy basically has baked into it. Every economic activity, every economic transaction has baked into it a certain average level of material and energy requirements. It's definitely good to get that down, but the scale of the thing is the scale of the thing. GDP is a terrible indicator of human well-being, but it is a fantastic indicator of human activity, of economic activity, and economic activity comes with a resource cost and an impact cost. So I think that was just a clear thing. The problem with economic growth is that it's also a political project, and that political project has been made responsible for lots of other things, including human well-being, economic development. If you're in the global south, the solution is growth. If you're poor, the solution is growth. If you're in progress or investment, the solution is growth. So the growth we call it sort of growthist politics or growthist ideology. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with fact, but it definitely has a lot to do with this ideal of growth, this justification of growth as a political project, where that growth is supposed to bring good things with it. And the fact is, I was never educated as an economist. I was educated as a physicist, and we're trained differently. We look for data, we look for reality. And there's some things that economic growth brings you. As Thomas Piketty has shown, it actually brings increasing inequality. So that's a problem. You're not going to solve poverty with growth. That's just not a thing. Piketty has buried that completely. But the other point that's really interesting, and this is not an original result of mine, but I have confirmed it. Actually, we've known it for 50 years, which is kind of upsetting, is that economic growth cannot explain statistically improvements in living conditions, improvements in life expectancy, improvements in well-being. It just is not the thing that does that. The two things are correlated, but one of the very basic things you learn in statistics is that correlation is not the same as causation. And if you look for the causal link, can one thing explain the other, you find that it can't, or very little. And so that's really interesting, because it means that we can think about human well-being completely differently from the way we think about economic growth. And when we think about human well-being, and I'm just going to share at least this slide, I will find it if my computer agrees, otherwise I won't care. Is that human well-being is not, in fact, reliant on economic growth, as long as we prioritize. Actually, it's not going to let me do it, is it? As long as we prioritize need satisfaction. So it depends what we do in the economy. That is the thing that really matters. And so I'm just going to try to make this as big as possible, because I know, is it sharing things or not? Yeah. So I'm just going to try to make this part as big as possible. And so this is a recent result by Leah Tamberg. And what it shows is it shows life evaluation, which is a measure of human well-being, versus GDP growth. And the blue curves are, the blue range is sort of what would normally happen. It's sort of the normal business as usual setting. The orange one, which is already doing a lot better, you basically see much higher levels of well-being at much lower levels of GDP, is when people's individual needs are satisfied. And the red extraordinary curve, which is it's not really a curve because practically flat, is when not only are individual needs satisfied, but collective needs are satisfied. So you're basically living in a society with good governance and nobody around you is poor. And basically that means that it's not how much we're doing in our economy that matters, but what we're doing in our economy that matters. And we've been able to do other research where we can sort of model what need satisfaction looks like in a physical sense. And I'm not going to show you a slide for that one, but you can find it easily. It's published in 2020 with Joel Millward Hopkins as a lead author, that the energy required for universal need satisfaction using pretty efficient technologies, especially on the demand side, like heat pumps. I think the BBC is not allowed to talk about heat pumps these days. The induction stoves, that kind of thing. You get much public transportation, all sort of efficient technologies, you can satisfy universal needs for a growing population, 9 billion, 10 billion, whatever, people at less than half of the energy that we currently use. Now, this is an extreme scenario because it involves lots of inequality, but it also involves massive amounts of deprivation, elimination. Basically, nobody will be in physical discomfort in this world. It is a world where everybody is okay. And that's just not where we're heading. So the point here is not that it's impossible to act on climate change. It is entirely possible to act on climate change, but it needs repurposing of the economy. It needs repurposing of investment, and it needs repurposing of our political system. Basically, we can't have the current levels of wealth inequality and the billionaires pushing us around. And this brings me to the second point I wanted to say. So basically, what this means is degrowth is fine. And degrowth is what we need to be doing. In terms of resource use, in terms of economic activity, we can scale it down, but it needs to be laser focused on human well-being. It needs to be really prioritizing what we need for our daily life to be good, and then we will be okay. And also have dealt with climate change and coincidentally, halt the sixth mass extinction at something reasonable. That involves changes in the food and land system and diets, but this is also eminently doable. Basically, plant-based diets and precision protein fermentation, and Bob's your uncle, you're fine. So we can do degrowth. Degrowth is technically possible. Degrowth is compatible with human well-being. However, it is incompatible with our current economic system, which is called capitalism, and it's incompatible with mass wealth accumulation. And this is bringing me to my second point, which is that the ideology of growth, this political program around it, has been pushed by, and the careers of neoclassical economists as well, have been pushed by a certain group of very powerful, very wealthy actors. The UK was ground zero for this, with the Institute of Economic Affairs funded by Anthony Fisher. But since then, and since his success in bringing Margaret Thatcher to power, these so-called think tanks, they actually don't do research, they do propaganda, have proliferated around the world. There's now, more than 500 of them at last count. They used to operate very openly. Now they're a bit more secretive and cagey because people are starting to pay attention, but it took people 50 years to pay attention. So they've had a pretty good run, or 40 years at least. So these neoliberal think tanks are pushing ideologies of vast inequality. They're very anti-democratic, and maybe this is something to pay attention to. And they are very anti-science. So the Atlas Network, one of the reasons I started paying attention to them is because they are the main source, generally, of climate denial, climate delay, and disinformation. And they are also pushing very unequal, that's their main job, is pushing very unequal neoliberal propaganda, including in schools. They've been very successful for decades in getting their curriculum materials into secondary education. At this point, probably all of the people in this Zoom have had economics teaching that has gone through or come from the Atlas Network in one way or another. So they've been very effective at those sort of mass propaganda. And they're very anti-democratic because they see democracy as a risk. They see democracy as totalitarian. How does that make sense to anybody? Well, it makes sense to them because democracy comes automatically, according to them. If you have a democracy, it comes with claims for social justice. They put it in scare quotes. And with claims for redistribution. And for them, that's the end of the world because these people represent the most wealthy. So for them, democracy is totalitarian because it impinges upon their freedom. And they've built this whole ideology of neoliberalism, which has liberty in it, liberal. And that's really freedom of producers, freedom of the wealthy people. And the whole market freedom ideology that they've developed is really about this one limited freedom of the wealthiest in our economies. They run everything. They brought Trump to power. They brought Milei to power. They have influenced every single major political party. That's why the left parties are currently so useless, like Labour is so useless in the UK, is because they've been taken over by neoliberal ideology as well. And they've also pushed the criminalization of climate protesters. Policy Exchange is an Atlas Network outfit. They pushed these draconian policing bills and succeeded. And so I think that we need to pay attention not only to the economic ideas, but also to who's been carrying them forward and making sure that they have had such a long and successful run at the detriment of everybody else.
Thank you so much, Julia. So, Steve, I wanted to give you a bit of an opportunity just to respond to anything that Julia had said, but also perhaps just to steer the discussion, starting actually with a question that came up in the chat, which is quite succinct in this of, do we think that it's possible for governments to actually adapt to degrowth strategies? And perhaps in answering that, you guys could also think about how we can, what role public policy, debt cancellation, citizens' assemblies and things like that can take place within a degrowth, and how that might affect change in the economic and political systems. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, if we'd done what the limits of growth recommended 50 years ago, yes, would be the answer. And in fact, limits of growth was shot down by bloody William Nordhaus. That was his first major academic contribution, to trash the limits of growth without understanding the damn thing and to denigrate it, which meant that work could go. It had a fair amount of public impact, but it had no impact upon the economics profession. In fact, they went in the opposite direction. So the trouble is, they gave what they said was necessary in 1975 were really extreme compared to what we actually did. So, for example, they said we had to stabilise population in 75. We had to reduce pollution by a factor of 4 in 75. We had to reduce raw materials use by the same factor. So there were enormous shifts in what was a very intelligent system dynamics program, but it said that's the scale of what's necessary. Now, instead, because I've listened to economists who have done nothing for the last 50 years, when you look at the rate of growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can fit it to a perfect exponential curve from 250 years ago. So it had no impact upon policy. We still use fossil fuels for between 85 and 80% of our total energy uses. So we are stuck. And if we are going to survive, we're going to have to drastically reduce energy consumption. And that means rationing. It means a whole range of things that economists will totally oppose, but of course it was necessary to help us survive during World War II. So I think we're facing a severe downturn. We talk about degrowth, so that there's going to be two forms of degrowth, forced on us by circumstance or attempted to manage. I'm very pessimistic. I think it's going to be forced on us by circumstance. But it's a huge shift that's necessary to be able to hang on to anything resembling an advanced civilization, given the need to drastically reduce carbon dioxide amongst many other forms of pollution. I don't think we'll get there. And the reason we won't get, we're going to be too complacent. And there's also the fact that it isn't just the elites that are caught into this. We all enjoy a life using huge amounts of energy, but we're not even conscious that we're doing it. And that's one reason we're trapped into this. Only when we realize that it is existential, and if we continue using energy at the scale we are now, we're going to destroy ourselves, and possibly in our own lifetimes, not in 80 years' time, but in 8 years' time. Then we have to completely change direction. And my feeling is we won't do it until we have a set of catastrophes, not just one, that kill large numbers of white people in in Europe and America. Then we might wake up, but I don't think we'll do anything until then, unfortunately.
Thank you, Steve. Julia, do you want to respond to them?
I would just say that I just watch out with the energy thing, because it turns out that from an energy systems perspective, fossil fuels, yes, they're 80%, but they're really a stupid 80%. You've got to understand that fossil fuels, we lose anywhere between half and 2/3 in waste heat. All coal, we use 2/3 of in waste heat. Gas, half at best. Petroleum, oil, 2/3. These are hard physical limits, because fossil fuels are stupid, evil, inefficient, dirty, dangerous clown energies, okay? And renewable energy are actually a lot more efficient, because you actually get things like the kind of heat and electricity you want directly. Mostly electricity, actually. And so the amount of comparing the amount of energy generated by renewables directly to the amount of primary energy extracted with fossil fuels is a false comparison, and nobody should be doing that anymore, because it really is a talking point of the fossil fuel industry. We actually need much less renewables because they're much less wasteful. However, we won't be able to substitute one-to-one, and we shouldn't want to substitute one-to-one. So in fact, I disagree with Steve's point on the advanced civilization not being possible. I think it's entirely possible. I think it'll be more advanced than our current one if we get there, because it'll be deprivation free. It requires a lot of investment, not just on the production side. Yeah, we need to generate some renewables, but on the demand side, because it's how we use it in our daily lives that matters for our well-being. And that's where we need to be really laser focused. If we invest a ton of jobs, work into the building sector, for instance, the building sector which is a huge energy consumer now, can consume very, very little in the future. So we also need to look at the demand side. And that's, again, something that the fossil fuel industry doesn't want us to do. And that the IPCC was only allowed to have a chapter on demand in its latest report because of, as soon as you question demand, you question consumption and consumer society, and you get yourself in trouble. So I think I think that those are some points on which we don't necessarily see eye to eye, just so that makes the talk more fun. We agree on a lot of things.
Happy to have those qualifications, Julia. I've been working at a higher level of, of course, the trouble is it's a huge investment necessary to make those sort of transformations.
We can take that into account, and that doesn't break the bank either.
Yeah,
so,
but it's getting people to realise they're necessary, and the problem is the politicians we elect are narcissists. They're advised by economists who haven't got a clue. That the main thing is we need to get those people out of the way to get sensible decisions made by people who know what they're talking about.
Exactly, but that means it's a political challenge much more than a technical challenge.
Yeah.
And the political challenge means that in terms of how do we get degrowth policies into place, we have a huge project working on this right now, and I don't want to make it sound more complicated than it is. I mean, there's great policies. They do a lot of different things that are good for us, but basically what it takes is political movements, which is why we're all here, is because we need to be part of movements to demand this change. Change is counterpower. The billionaires that exist now are wealthier than the pharaohs could ever dream of. They are not going to go down without a fight. Trump and his friends, and from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel to Mark Andreessen to all of them, right? They are not going to give up their Bill Gates or the Charles Koch or all of them. They are not going to go down without a fight. In fact, they are fighting us. We don't realize it, but that's what the world that we've been living in is the world that we've been living in is the world that they've been winning in. And I think that that's something that we need to take super seriously, is that this will only change when we are capable of building counter-political movements that have the power that are powerful enough to coerce change. Change does not happen without coercion.
Thank you both. And kind of building upon this conversation, I wanted to ask, how can we, beyond political movements as well, how can we build mass support for post-growth or degrowth ideas in the hope that we can make change before it's imposed on us? And perhaps thinking, it's obviously clear that we need to try and get the truth out about what our economic system is doing, both to our own well-being, the ecological well-being, but also, is there a role there in academia, and what can academia be doing more? I'm sure we can identify many faults, but what's also being said in the academic world of these ideas?
The problem with these ideas is that they exist mostly in the academic world. That's the problem. I think there was a recent article about the abolition of slavery, I think in The Guardian. It was actually quite good, where it compared the French movement and the British movement, and the French movement talked a lot and got nowhere, and the British movement, because it was all academics and poets and stuff, and the British movement was made of, slightly stereotypically business people and entrepreneurs, and they tried to get it done. So I think that the problem a bit with degrowth is that we have been stuck in academia as one of the last few places where you can be lucky enough to think what you want and say what you want. We do benefit from a lot of freedom, but these ideas do need to be taken up more broadly, and we have to find a way to help with that and carry the message outside academia. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to combating propaganda, like the same way that we combat climate denial, the same way that we combat any kind of disinformation. These economic ideas, the neoclassical economic ideas and the neoliberal ideology that accompanies them, are nonsense propaganda that only are able to exist because they support power and status quo. Otherwise, they would be laughed out of every serious kind of institution. So I think that's a big job to do, and we definitely need a lot more people to help us with that communication, because academics, we are trained to communicate obscurely, which is bad.
And there's also the fact that we know that politicians in charge are going to do the wrong thing well before they do the right thing. So in some sense, you have to prepare to be in a government in exile. So what would you, if you were in a position of power, what would you do? Now, one thing that there's many, I see geoengineering as inevitable because the crisis is going to hit us well before we make the sort of adjustments Julia's talking about there. And so we have to avoid total collapse. And that front, one group that I support is called MIR, which stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. Of the various geoengineering attempts, that to me it's the most flexible and least intrusive and easily modified, with local benefits as well, with the mirrors reducing heat in slum areas and so on. But you have to say, well, if we were running what we would do, here are the things we'd do. We'd have rationing. We'd have an alternative monetary system. We'd have an alternative political system based on sortition rather than ego-feeding political elections. So start designing the alternative system, because when we start seeing catastrophic damage in white countries, the politicians and the advisors, as you can see from the quotes I gave, are completely stunned at what the hell happens, and they'll do completely the wrong thing. That's why you have to prepare for to be a government in exile and plan what would be necessary, how could you survive. That's what I'd advise exile to work on.
Thank you, Steve and Julia. I wanted to touch a bit upon a few people have been commenting and asking questions with regards to the wealthiest 0.1%, the billionaire class, and so on. And there was just recently a question of how we can leverage millionaires to push governments to create a new and parallel wealth tax system that only funds basic income-based need. What inputs do you guys have with regards to that ruling elite, the ruling economical elite, what it looks like for them, what's coming for them, but also how we might be able to make change, if that's even possible, within the billionaire classes, and what that's doing to our well-being and the ecological well-being?
Well, I think that the only good billionaire is not a billionaire. So the existence of billionaires is as of any extreme wealth is a failing of our society. And these people, wealth does things to even to good people. It basically messes them up. They stop being able to. There are all these reasons why wealth inequality and is a threat to democracy and a threat to functioning societies, because they basically become completely separate from the real world. They don't know what poverty looks like anymore. They don't know what people criticizing them are like anymore, because they live surrounded by people whose jobs depend on making them feel good. So their whole existence becomes detached from reality, detached from empathy, detached from being a normal person, and their politics follow, and their politics are horrible pretty much universally. And also, don't be fooled by the whole foundation things. Foundations are always sort of a modern day indulgence to buy back the soul of the crimes they've committed. So there is no such thing as billionaire reform except for expropriation and radical taxation and just taking that wealth away from them. I think another thing that we have to understand, I mean, I've been trying to read up on this, and I think I've read enough to be convinced. Human societies used to be much more egalitarian. So we've had hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens being egalitarian. And that's something that we can do and have been good at. But the only way you do it is not by resting on your laurels and saying, hey, guess what? We've achieved a utopian egalitarian society. The way you do it is by being super hyper vigilant and kicking down anybody who would bring inequality to the society. Like, equality is a fragile, unstable equilibrium in human societies. And the only way you maintain it is if you nip in the bud any attempt to create inequality. And we've been wildly failing at that recently. And now that's something that we have to, I don't see any other way around.
For my part, it's clear that the huge part of the damage we're doing is out of the inequality. You would have seen a study recently saying that at least 30% of carbon dioxide is generated by the top 1% of the population, or something of that scale. And it's true. And everything we have in our society ignores inequality. So one proposal that I've put a link into in the chat was called ecocore.org, something I came up with that I found somebody had beaten me to the idea, a guy called Adam Hardy. And that was about having a parallel monetary system where everything has both a money price price and a carbon price. The carbon allowance is set at the average for every country. So you and I and Rupert Murdoch would all get the same amount of carbon allowance. Within minutes well, probably before he woke up, Rupert would have exhausted his allowance for the day and have to buy off the poor. The homeless would have the largest amount of selling power with the tiny amount of carbon they currently use. So if they're going to buy carbon credits to continue shopping, they have to buy off the poor. So we need a mechanism to reverse what the monetary system has done, which is increase the inequality in favour of the rich, do it in the opposite direction. Also, we have to understand government finances, and mainstream economics is completely misleading on that front as well. Once you realise the government creates the money it spends, then you don't have the debt issues and all the subservience to hedge funds and so on that we see as part of current politics, particularly in the UK. So it's awareness of how governments create money, and that it will be government money creation that enables us to turn this around if we do succeed. And we need mechanisms that reverse the inequality that the monetary system has generated in the last 50 years.
Thank you both. There's some food for thought there. And just expanding on what we've just been speaking about, another question that's come through is history shows us that for a revolution to succeed, the ideas for a new way have to be waiting in the wings. Are the new economic ideas waiting in the right places now? And if not, how do we get them there? Steve, do you want to speak to that first?
I'm not the only person I'm not the only person by a large shot who's developing an alternative approach to economics. For example, my colleague Jamie Galbraith is doing some great work on alternative economics. So is a mathematician called Ole Peters with what he calls ergodicity economics. But there is, I think, an alternative paradigm available now. And we need that alternative paradigm to be learned as widely as possible. So I'm giving online courses about it. All my writing in my Patreon and Substack is about how we can have an alternative economic analysis that points out the role of energy in production, that understands government money creation, and that sees what inequality is the destructive force that Julia's identified it as being. So we need all that. It's outside the university sector. You'll never find it in universities except in low-rank universities where the staff are precarious anyway. So start looking for in terms of like Kate Raworth is another thing with the donut approach. Mariana Mazzucato, the role of the state in innovation. My work, that of Ole Peters and of Jamie Galbraith and Chen, whom he's working with. I think you can find it. We just need to get it constructed as fast as possible. And largely that involves a large amount of support from the public, because we're doing this without government backing, without universities. That's what we need. We exist. We just need to be known more widely.
Maybe I can just add that, I'm at a not terribly high-ranked university. There's some universities where you can do this stuff, and we are able to exist, not within economics departments.
That's exactly what I meant. It's economists that are the pain in the ass, not the other, not genuine sciences.
But so we're trying to do this, and actually there's a whole raft, at least within the European space, of research that's suddenly allowed to happen, I should say, on degrowth and post-growth, including I went for 10 years of having one failed grant submission after another. You have to be able to deal with a lot of rejection in this business, but, really on ideological grounds. And then when we were finally allowed to do the research because of an unorthodox funder, then we were able to demonstrate that it's really viable and we can see things and publish things and it's okay. And then, and now there's really a whole raft of large European projects that go against the grain of normal economics. There's the WISE project, there's 2B, there's MAPS, there's the REAL project, which is the one I'm on, which is realizing post-growth deals. And so we're starting to have this space to at least think about it and do some of the modeling, but it's very late to be able to do that. We've really been stopped from doing that for decades.
Thank you, Julia and Steve. It's a lot for us to go away and research and have a look into. And I just want to bring it back to Julia. You brought up the Atlas Network. And I think many of us are aware or have heard of Project 2025. If you're joining us from the States, obviously, you've had the direct impact of these think tanks and what they've done to the political systems. And there's certainly concerns over in the UK and in other countries, the role of these think tanks. Julie, would you be able to expand about the Atlas Network and its influence on our economic system and what we're seeing in our current context in our political situation?
So it's a long story and it goes back about a century. So if you want the full history of neoliberal thinking And it's self-contradictory as well, by the way. Like, it's not like, oh, there's one way of thinking about it, because if for instance, in beginning, neoliberal thought was very pro-competitiveness because they saw a meritocratic social order emerging from competition in a market. And then when their funders started being monopolies, they started being a bit against competition and pro-monopoly, because they basically depend for their livelihoods on these funders. They always say that climate scientists are there for the money, but these people are really there for the money. Their ideas are sort of hard to grasp because they're constantly sort of changing around. And also because they have different levels of propaganda. There's a fantastic book by Nancy McLean called Democracy in Chains. If you're American, I really recommend you read this. You might want to read it if you're a South American as well, because it involves a story of what happened to Chile, which is due to these people. Democracy in Change actually refers to the Chilean constitution, which prevents Chile from doing anything, and was written by James Buchanan, who got the Nobel Prize in economics. And so what the Atlas Network think tanks do is they basically propagate. The reason I started talking about Nancy McLean is she had access through James Buchanan's archives, which weren't very well organized or sorted, to confidential memos and correspondence between him and Charles Koch, of course, of the Koch brothers, of course, the major ideologues and bankrollers of the conservative movement in the US and to some extent worldwide, very much anti-climate. And the thing is, the Atlas Network has these different layers of communication. So what we get from the Atlas Network is propaganda. They basically train up people, young guys, usually it's very much a male-dominated world, young guys who look good on TV, who are able to write a couple of newspaper columns a week, and then they sort of promote them into media roles, and they basically give a very polished version of easy to digest version of what neoliberal ideology is. Again, justifying inequality, saying that we need market freedom, saying that any redistribution is totalitarian, et cetera. Saying that any climate action is unwarranted. So that's one of the things they do. But at the higher level of communication, when they're talking amongst themselves, like Charles Koch was talking to James Buchanan, they're very overt. Their goal is to subvert democracy. Their goal is to preserve wealth. Their goal is to stop any kind of a mass movement socialist orientation. That's their real goal. And they do not care about democracy. They do not care about anybody's freedom except for their own. And they're perfectly happy with authoritarian countries like Chile under Pinochet. That was their ideal country, in fact. For them, that country was free because he allowed them to do things in the market that they wanted to do, despite the fact that he was killing hundreds and thousands of leftists and torturing them and disappearing them. So that their ideology is really abhorrent to the vast, vast, vast majority of people on this planet, which is why they've had to hide it under these other layers of propaganda. And what the Atlas Network is doing is it's basically churning out that propaganda that they themselves don't believe in, so that their political positions are protected. That's basically what the Atlas Network does. And climate denial, as important as it is just one of their side activities. It's not even their main job. And they're so good at it. It's all very sad.
Just to add to that, I mean, the trouble is that though it's true about the Koch brothers saying this stuff and, they couldn't care whether it's true or not, the vast majority of mainstream economists believe their own bullshit. Okay? It's the same as being if you're a devout believer in Catholicism, you believe in the virgin birth, yada yada yada. If somebody managed to find the birth control pills for Mary, then they'd bury you rather than bury the evidence. So there's a sincere belief, which is the main danger, because they sincerely believe this stuff. They say it without needing the financial backing. They'll say it till they die. They'll say it till they destroy us. So sincerity is dangerous in this area. And the thing is, because they sincerely say what people like the Koch brothers want, that's why they get the funding, and people like myself and Julia obviously do not. So what we need is support from the community that's here to enable us to do our work, but you really have to build an alternative, realistic approach to take their place. And when you do that, you end up with, you go straight from economics definitions that lead to cycles, income inequality, financial breakdown, all being normal aspects of a capitalist economy. That's how it behaves. And we need to get that realism before people rather than the fantasies of, equilibrium and utility maximization, et cetera, that these people themselves have fallen for. And that's why they're so dangerous. The most dangerous and effective con man is the person who believes his own bullshit. And that's what neoclassical economists are like.
Thank you both. So thank you to everyone that has been sending in questions and answers. And Steve and Julie have been kind enough to start answering some of those questions that we haven't yet spoken out. But there's also another question here in the chat. What do you think of Yanis Varoufakis' ideas laid out in Techno-Feudalism? And I was thinking also if you guys could touch upon the role of cryptocurrencies that we're seeing and the rise of that and where that future might lie.
Quickly, Yanis is a close personal friend, and I've reviewed that book and interviewed Yanis about it. I was initially skeptical until I found one day that Apple was going to take 30% of my Patreon revenue, which is just classic feudal behaviour. We've got the gatekeepers, you've got to give us 30%, and bugger the fact we give you nothing in return for the 30%. So there is a truth to the argument that capitalism has evolved into a form of feudalism, where if you're not born wealthy, you can't get wealth, where people who currently occupy positions of gatekeeper roles make money out of being gatekeeper. That's all true. But I still think it's the basic dynamics of capitalism, the fact that workers don't have power, and if you don't give them countervailing power, they get screwed by the capitalists. So the abolition of trade unions, which was that was another neoliberal agenda to weaken the trade union movement. That's what's weakened our capacity to bargain back. It's also partly where the woke failures come from, because I know from being involved in the very first neoliberal party to do this, which is the Australian Labor Party in 1976, they basically said, let's combine good economics with progressive social policies. And what they chose for good economics was bloody textbook garbage that I knew was dangerous. And what it meant was the progressive parties married neoliberal policy, which led to the inequality we've got, along with promoting different little social groups, women, gay, Indigenous, you name it. And that's because it's failed. They let the working class down in general. They've abandoned the working class, went for minority politics, and that's what's led to the attitude about wokeism. So there's a huge need to shift that entire political agenda, and the undermining of the trade union movement was the beginning of, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of our capacity to resist the power that billionaires now have.
Thank you, Steve. So also there was a question in the chat a bit earlier. Here we go. So are we in effect talking about shifting the economy to produce for need rather than profit and bringing production under democratic control? Do we think a Marxist analysis is useful? So twisting it back on its head from where we've started, Marx would be proud for us to bring it back to this.
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think a Marxist analysis is always useful because, he analyzed capitalism and he analyzed the dynamics of capitalism and how it leads to, inequality and exploitation and so on. So I think certainly a Marxist analysis is useful. It's still the way that reality surrounds us. And we should be reorganizing the economy for needs and not for profit. That we've been living in this ideology that tells us that we should do things for the economy. And then somehow later in the day, later in the century, God knows, at some point, the economy would then do things for us. And it turns out that from an engineering perspective, from a resource use perspective, et cetera, we should just do the things we want to do in the first place and organize our economy to enable us to do that. We have the workforce capacity, we have the technical capacity. The only thing we need to do is to have an economy that then permits us to do these things that we actually have the capacity to do, rather than stand in our way. And one of the things that we propose here is economic democracy. Right now, we have these liberal democracies that basically have decided not to give up in the face of free market fundamentalism, and basically say that the economy is its own sovereign and makes its own decisions through equilibrium and the invisible hand and all this nonsense that Steve's been talking about. And so we should let the economy make its own decisions for us, because the economy knows best, because it's basically some kind of a super intelligent God. And Hayek was basically saying that kind of thing not quite as a funny terms, but pretty close. And I think economic democracy is a program that Marx did not advocate for sufficiently. So I think that that's something that we should do, is basically say, no, we take the decisions in the economy, not a market god. And for us to do it, we have to do it collectively using our various intelligences. We have to do it in an economic, in a democratic way. And so that's one of the things we're thinking about in the REAL project, is economic democracy and how to realize that.
I think one of the main things that the neoliberal agenda has said is said market good, government bad, and what that's meant is you don't have provision of social goods. You got private goods instead. And what Jamie Galbraith's father said, you get public affluence and private affluence and public squalor. That's come out of it. Now, we realise that there are some things the government can do that the private sector will never do, and that tends to involve long-lived assets. The rate of return for private individuals for building a sewerage system, for example, is so low that they won't do it in the first place, so we get dysentery coming out of that. The public sector will provide it. So you need a dramatic shift in favour of the public sector over the private, and that's partly Marx's agenda. At the same time, there are errors in Marx, just like there are errors in the neoclassicals. That was my original research topic. That comes back to the labour theory of value, which is logically false according to Marx's own logic. You can find a thesis of mine on that front. So Marx's the orientation Marx had about equality and the power to the people and so on is valid. Some of their analysis is not. So again, there's still the need to reform economics. It isn't just the neoclassicals have stuffed things up.
Thank you, Steve. So we've got 5 more minutes left, and I just wanted to ask if we could end it on a bit of hope. So if you guys would like to choose an example that you're seeing that perhaps has been an economic scheme that you've seen piloted and some successes, and how that's impacted the thinking and perhaps even governments and other governments to implement some of these economic changes that we can do to make things less shit, basically.
So one of the things that, because there's a lot of techno-pessimist, there's the sort of techno-optimist versus techno-pessimist, which really, that debate annoys me like crazy. It's not about technology, it's who's in control of it, how it's used, what's developed, what's rolled out. It's a question of, again, of social priorities. But the fact is that we have some really magical technologies on the horizon or amongst us, not like non-existent stuff that the IPCC modeling relies on, like negative technologies, negative emissions. That stuff's nonsense. But technologies that allow us to live well at really low levels of energy use. And these things are really magical. Like heat pumps are magical. They produce more energy than you put into them. Physics still works, right? It's because they're taking it from temperature differences in the environment. But heat pumps are a great thing that people didn't have before, and we have now, and we can use them in houses, and it's great. Another thing that's fantastic is induction stoves. They're basically magical things. And they're just beautiful. They work beautifully. Anybody who doesn't love an induction stove is wrong. Hi, Anne.
Hi, I got the time wrong. I didn't realize it was European time. Oh my God, I'm such a British Brexiter. I'm so sorry.
Hi, Anne. Welcome.
It's lovely to see you, Anne.
We'd better give you the last 5 minutes, Anne.
No, I mean, have we still got time?
Yes,
3 minutes and counting.
Can I just quickly say my say in 3 minutes? So I want to say that capitalism is eating itself, and we need to be aware of this. And the reason for it is inequality. So inequality in the United States, inequality in China and Germany and Europe across the board is imbalancing capitalism. And for this reason, the inequality is focused on exports. And Julia will have heard me make this argument before. So the export sector of both China, the United States, and here tend to be given preference, except in the United States, they've been neglected. And that leads to massive inequality. But what it's doing more than anything else, because of inequality, capitalism is overproducing. We're in a state of overproduction, if you like. And we see it in our shops, and we see it in our economies every day of the week, really, where you see there's just so much stuff everywhere. And because of inequality, the majority, working people, if you like, those who live by their wage, cannot afford to buy all that is produced. And that despite a massive advertising campaign to get them to buy the stuff, right? Despite all that, we've got this massive overproduction. And so this is a real crisis. And from a green perspective, I think we need to understand it not as overconsumption, but as overproduction. And that is capitalism eating itself. And so we must prepare for this because, you know, the trade wars are class wars, as Michael Pettis and Matt Klein have argued. And that's leading to massive political disruption as well as to imbalances in the global economy. And I'm so sorry, I've missed this session. I could kick myself. I've been waiting for you.
So thank you so much.
I'll kick you when I come to London, Anne, to make up for it.
Right.
So we have actually got a short break between now and when the next sessions are going. So if the speakers are able to stay on for another 5 minutes, perhaps we can just have a short discussion now with Anne here, because we were touching on some of the things that Anne brought up. But Steve, I just wanted to invite you to reply back to what Anne just said.
Yeah, I mean, we have an incredible amount of wasteful stuff generated in capitalism, no doubt about it. Part of that's one of the reasons capitalism being successful is the incredible diversity of products it generates. And this is one of the areas where the blindness of mainstream economics obscures why it succeeded and also why it's a failure. Because neoclassical economics says everything's homogenous. You assume, there's a car market and there's a supply and demand curves for cars. Total bullshit. There's an incredible diversity of cars, which is partly where capitalism causes evolutionary change over time. But of course, that also leads to the massive energy consumption we use, and we socialise our losses and privatise our profits, and that's a major part of why we're in this dilemma right now. So it's the lack of awareness of energy, the lack of awareness that we're on a finite planet. I literally reviewed a book recently written by an English economist, Daniel Susskind, and I finally found a quote I've been looking for a long time from an economist. Yes, it is possible to have infinite growth on a finite planet. If you're that bloody brain dead, you can't see any of the issues, any of the problems you're causing, but that's the nature of the entire economics profession. So the fact that they've got a false description of capitalism is one reason why we're in the dilemma we are now, and that leads to the situation Anne's talking about, where we have masses and masses of stuff being produced, where the stuff does not relate to, as Julia said earlier, the quality of our lives. And it's only what you measure that you can put into GDP. What you measure is destroying the natural environment. We need to see ourselves as custodians of the natural life on this planet rather than destructors of it. And that'll take an entire change in economics, as well as, I think, the crisis we're going to go through courtesy of global warming and the complete ignorance of its dangers by mainstream economists and the mainstream politicians they advise.
Thank you, Stephen. Anne, I just wanted to ask as well, if from what you've just brought up, what role can public policy play within the changes that we need in the economic system? And what kind of pressures can we be putting on politicians, economists, companies, so on?
So public policy is extraordinarily important. Right now, most of it is geared towards supporting capitalism in doing this. So we give massive subsidies to exporters, for example. And we are happy to repress wages at home, especially in Europe. And we're happy for them to stay down. And the Bank of England goes to great lengths to repress wages. The Bank of England is currently in a panic because, to quote its chief economist in The Guardian the other day, people are using wages to maintain their living standards, he said, with shock and horror. We have to stop them maintaining their living standards. We've got to put interest rates up even higher and make it very difficult for them to maintain their living standards. So we're in a position where public policy could do a great deal. And I think for us to understand it as public policy, it's not rocket science, by the way, we should understand it as managing the domestic economy. We don't manage our economies. We've left it to something called the invisible hand, a global invisible hand, for that matter. We don't think it's the government's role to manage the economy. And indeed, governments don't think it's their role. The governments think, the Tory government and now the Labour government think it's their role to win the next election and to do that with lots of PR. The idea of governing and of managing the economy is something they really can't grasp. And so they are subject to the whims of capitalism. They are subject to what capitalism wants out of the market. They are not, if you like, managing capitalism. So I like to talk about managing capitalism. And the most important lever, in my view, and it's a single lever for managing capitalism, is what capitalists call capital controls, but which I would call macroprudential tools, or managing the flow of capital across borders, in and out. That is fundamental to stabilizing the economy. It's fundamental to ending inequality. It's fundamental to giving the democratic state the power to influence economic policy. Without that, no, we can't tax the rich. It's impossible. When people say tax the wealthy, I think that's utterly delusional. In a world of capital mobility, the rich can simply move their capital across the border, into Ireland, for example. So you can't go around taxing the rich, because that is delusional without some way of managing the border and the flow of capital across border. We're obsessed with managing migratory flows. We don't care too much, but we do manage trade flows. We won't allow certain goods, we won't allow chlorinated chicken in, for example, even with Trump in charge. But we will allow money to just move when it fancies like doing that. When it's made enough, when private equity have extracted enough wealth from this country and they want to put it in some tax haven, we say, go ahead, do as you please. And that is what deprives governments and states of the power to frame public policy.
And that's when you look at Keynes's proposal for Bancor, which was what we should have had as the Bretton Woods, he specifically said we need capital controls. Now, instead we've got capital profligacy. And that's one of the major hassles. And again, that's why taxation is so ineffective. And I know Gary Stephenson was mentioned earlier. I like his idea of taxing wealth. That might be a way of, because it's harder to move wealth than it is to remove income or to hide where income is. So it's feasible potentially to do that. So Gary's ideas are worth supporting, I think. We need to get Gary understanding the non-orthodox approach to economics as well. I think he's quite amenable. I saw one of his recent talks was with Ha-Joon Chang, and Ha-Joon Chang's one of our crowd on that front. So, yeah, getting hold of, if anybody get in touch with Gary and get him to talk to us, that might improve our capacity to communicate.
I think that this is really important. I've been loving his videos. I completely agree with you, Steve. And the last one he said, who's complete in burnout, he needs economists to work with him. He's gone away for 4 months because he just can't take it anymore. So I think by the end of the summer, that's a mission for us to get a mini group to be ready to talk to him and be there for him. I would be very excited about that, actually.
Yeah, I understand burnout as well. Well and truly.
We all do, yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to a close. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Julia. And thank you, Anne. And thank you to everyone for your questions and comments in the chat. So we're having a little lunch break now, and there will be sessions again from 1:30, both in the main track. So there'll be roundtables and keynote speakers. If you want to find out a bit more about things like the Atlas Network, we've got Nafisa Ahmed will be speaking in the closing session a bit later today. And we've also got some great community workshops going on as well. So thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you in some sessions later on today.
Thank you. Cheers.